Jim Feig coming to you from South Bridge Street Live. This is your master photographer talking today about macro photography. I want to especially emphasize what we can do with the macro lens today in taking very close-up photographs. And I'm using for my photographs this morning this green plant you see on the screen. This is a very special plant, if you would. Notice that as little bumps all over the edges of the leaves. Those are new plants coming on. This is called, some people call it the 100 babies plant, the 1,000 babies plant, or the 1,000,000 babies plant. This one looks like it's got at least 1,000 on there or more. Each one of those little bumps is a new plant that will drop off, and if it lands on dirt, it'll grow. And the image you see right now on the screen, the full plant, that's the kind of image you might take with the regular lens that you're using on your camera right now, a normal lens, whether you're using a zoom or a prime lens. This is using a non-macro lens. This is the kind of image you might get. Nice image. Pretty green plant, but we want to get in closer and see what those individual little plants look like more closely. So we're gonna go the macro route today, macro photography. I do a Monday morning macro on South Bridge Street Live every week, so you might check into that sometime when you get a chance. But this was one of them a couple of weeks ago. Okay, what do you have for close focusing equipment in your camera bag anyway? Do you have a macro lens? Do you have a zoom lens that says macro on it? Well, that zoom lens is not a true macro lens. It's will give you about a quarter life size or maybe a half life size image at most. It'll give you something like that, what you see here in photograph number 2. Notice now we're seeing some detail. You're seeing some detail on those little plants now. We've got the big plant out of the way, and we can see about a half a dozen or so of the little plants, and we're seeing some detail. So even though the lens we're using is not a true macro lens, doesn't give us a one-to-one relationship, why, it is giving us a nice close-up shot of the plant itself. It's working for us. Okay, let's go to photograph number 3. This is done with the true macro lens. And as you can see, it's a shot of one of these little individual plants on the leaf of that big plant. This little plant's going to fall off. You can even see the silky hairs there. That's its root structure. It will become a plant when it falls off if it lands in the ground. Okay, this is your true macro lens. The true macro lens gives you a one-to-one life-size image. What you see, what you're taking a picture of, and the image that you have on your sensor can be life-size if you're focused to the extreme extent with the macro lens. Okay, let's talk about what it takes to take a sharp image like this with a macro lens. We've got some problems to work around. First of all, as we get closer and closer and closer to this subject, we get a shallower depth of field, so it's harder and harder to keep things in focus. Let's go back to photograph 2. Go back to photograph 2 and look at it a bit. You'll see those little plants on the very front are nicely in sharp focus, but as we go back around the edge of the leaf to the little plants toward the back, they're starting to get soft. They're not completely in focus anymore. And as you look at the leaf behind the plants, it's completely out of focus. We're talking about inches here for our depth of field. And this is what we have to contend with when we're working with macro photography. Okay, so we've got several problems we're dealing with here. The shallow depth of field. How do we get around the shallow depth of field? What tools do we have to use? Well, Aperture size and focal length of the lens are your big tools to control this with here. I'm working with a 90 millimeter f2.8 macro lens when I go down to the macro image. So my focal length is set. If you've got a macro lens, yours is probably set too, whatever it is, anywhere from 50, 55 up to maybe Canon, I think, makes 180 millimeter, maybe Nikon too. Anyway, we're set with our focal length, so aperture adjustments become the big tool for controlling depth of field here. The smaller we set that aperture, the more of our image is in focus. So we're going to go to a fairly small aperture setting here, about an f16, f22, just to get the depth of field we need to get the good sharp image. What does that mean? Well, as we go to the smaller and smaller and smaller aperture, we're restricting the light that's coming into the camera. We're going to either need to add more light to the subject, if we have it, or we're going to have to go to a slower and slower and slower shutter speed. And that's the route I'm going to take here, the slower shutter speed. The other thing I need to worry about, since depth of field is so shallow, I need to make sure I'm focusing on the most important part of my image. I've got to do some more critical focusing with my camera as I work to take this image. And if I'm doing a still life like this with a macro lens, I will frequently, in fact most often, switch to a manual focus technique to take the photo. So let's talk about it a little bit more. We've got a slower shutter speed and a more critical focus to work with. It says we need to support our camera somehow, because the slower shutter speed says that, gee, you're not going to handhold that. And the more critical focus says you're not going to handhold that. You want a solid support. I'm going to put my camera on a tripod. I'll do this for most still study macro shots like this. Now, if I was out working with something that's not stationary, maybe I'm trying to shoot butterflies or something, I'll use different technique altogether. This is the technique I'm using for a still life. I frequently use it on my flower photography. It gives me excellent results. Okay, so I put my camera on a tripod. Now I'm going to do some special focusing that will get me the sharp image I want. Camera on a tripod. I'm going to now compose the image the way I want it. I want to get one little plant. I'm going to move the camera in or move the plant to the camera until I fill the frame with the image that I want. And then I'm going to adjust the camera to a rough focus to put everything in focus. I've got my image where I want it. I've got my composition where I want it. Now I'm going to switch my camera to live view. What does that do? If I switch to live view, I now see that image that I'm working with, not in the optical viewfinder of the camera, but on the screen on the back, the live view screen on the back of the camera. And I can see my composition there, and I can adjust that. Okay. Now I want to focus on the important point. There's a red box in my camera. Yours might be a red dot or a cross or something. Whatever you see for your focus point, move that. You can use the four-way switch to move that to the most important point on your image. Most important point. We move the point we're focusing on to that most important point. Then I magnify my image view on the live view screen. There's no matter which camera I have. Canon has one over on the upper right. Nikon has a button down the lower left. You can use that button to magnify the image you're looking at on the live view screen. Now, what I have now is the most important part of that image enlarged, my focus point right on that part. I'm going to now manually focus that lens to give me the sharpest image I can. You can see it on the live view screen. Just adjust your lens focus until you get the sharp image that you need on the live view screen. Then finally we're going to take the photograph, and I will take that with a remote shutter trip so that I don't touch the camera. If I don't have a remote shutter trip with me, I'll have myself timer set on my camera so that when I touch the camera, I can get back away and let the camera stabilize again before the shutter trips, before the picture is taken. So what I've done, I've set my aperture to a small aperture to give me as much depth of field as I need. I've carefully focused on the most important part of the plant using a live view focusing technique. I've got my camera locked down tight on a good solid tripod. I'm releasing the shutter with a remote trip so that I don't bump the camera in any way when I take it, and you'll be surprised how sharp an image you can get this way. This is the way I take most of my flower photography. And look at my flowers sometimes. They're nice and sharp. They're nice and sharp. And this is the way I get those good sharp photos. So go out, get your macro lens, put it on your camera, take some nice pictures like this. And try this technique. I think you will like it. It works for most cameras. And I want to see some of your macro photography here. This is Jim Feig coming to you from South Bridge Street Live. I'll see you again.